Before we dive in, pause for a moment and tell me something. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Maybe it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France. Don't just watch quietly. Drop a comment below and let's see how far this story reaches across the world. Now, lean in, and let's begin. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty trail when Peter Beaumont first saw her. There, tied to a weathered fence post at the edge of his property, was the most beautiful woman he'd ever laid eyes on. Her long black hair hung like silk over her shoulders, and her dark eyes held a mixture of defiance and fear that made his heart skip a beat. A crude wooden sign hung around her neck, carved with words that made his blood run cold. Cowboys Don't Forgive. Peter's horse shifted nervously beneath him as he approached. The woman's dress was torn and dirty, suggesting she'd been there all night. Her wrists were bound with rough rope that had left angry red marks on her skin. Despite her predicament, she held her chin high, watching him with the fierce pride of a wild Mustang that refuses to be broken. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the whisper of wind through the prairie grass. "Ma'am," Peter said softly, dismounting his horse with careful, deliberate movements. He could see she was Comanche. Her features and the beadwork on her dress told him that much. But what was she doing here, tied up like some kind of criminal? His hand moved instinctively to his knife, ready to cut her bonds. But something in her eyes stopped him. There was a story here, and it was written in pain. The woman's lips parted slightly as if she wanted to speak, but no words came. Instead, she studied his face with an intensity that made him feel like she was looking straight through to his soul. Peter had lived alone on this ranch for 3 years, ever since he'd come west to escape the memories of the war. He'd grown used to solitude, but something about this moment felt like the beginning of everything changing. As he reached for his knife to cut her free, a distant dust cloud appeared on the horizon. Riders were coming fast, and from the way the woman's eyes widened in terror, Peter knew they weren't bringing good news. Whatever had led to this moment, whatever crime or betrayal had resulted in her being tied to this post, the real story was about to begin. Peter's knife sliced through the ropes with swift, practiced strokes. The woman's hands fell to her sides, and she rubbed her wrists gingerly, never taking her eyes off the approaching dust cloud. "Can you ride?" Peter asked urgently. She nodded once, a sharp, determined movement that told him she was stronger than she looked. Without hesitation, he helped her onto his horse and swung up behind her, feeling the tension in her body as those distant riders drew closer. They rode hard toward his cabin, a modest structure he'd built with his own hands from pine logs and determination. The woman sat perfectly still in front of him, her back straight as an arrow. Peter could smell the faint scent of sage in her hair and feel the rapid beating of her heart through her thin dress. Neither of them spoke during the ride, but he could sense her calculating, planning, surviving, in the way that only someone who'd faced real danger could understand. The cabin came into view just as the sun reached its peak. Peter guided his horse around to the back, where a small barn provided cover from prying eyes. As he helped her down, their eyes met for the first time since he'd found her. Up close, he could see the strength etched in every line of her face, the intelligence that sparked behind her dark eyes. She was beautiful, yes, but it was the kind of beauty forged in fire and tempered by trials. "They'll come looking," she said finally, her voice soft but clear. It was the first time he'd heard her speak, and her English was perfect, though accented with the musical cadence of her native tongue. Peter nodded, understanding immediately that whoever had tied her to that post wouldn't give up easily. He gestured toward the cabin, and she followed him inside, moving with the silent grace of someone accustomed to staying invisible. Inside the simple one-room cabin, she stood near the window, watching the trail they'd just traveled. Peter found himself studying her profile, the proud line of her nose, the determined set of her jaw. "My name is Peter," he said quietly. She turned to look at him, and for a moment he saw something vulnerable flicker across her features before the walls went back up. "Blessing," she replied simply, and somehow that one word felt like the most precious gift he'd ever received. As the afternoon wore on, Peter learned Blessing's story in fragments, each piece more heartbreaking than the last. She had been married to a white trader named David Morrison, a man who'd come to her village promising peace and prosperity. Their marriage had been meant to bridge two worlds, to create understanding between her people and the settlers who kept pushing further into Comanche territory. For a time, it had worked. David had been kind, respectful of her ways, and genuinely seemed to love both her and her culture. But gold had changed everything. When David discovered a rich vein on land that belonged to her tribe, the man she'd married began to disappear, replaced by someone driven by greed and ambition. He'd started making deals with mining companies, selling rights to land that wasn't his to sell. When Blessing confronted him, begging him to remember his promises to her people, he'd grown cold and distant. The tender husband who'd once braided flowers in her hair became a stranger who looked at her like she was just another obstacle to his fortune. The breaking point had come when David tried to force her to sign papers that would give him legal claim to vast stretches of Comanche territory. When she refused, he'd flown into a rage, striking her for the first time. That night, she'd fled into the darkness, planning to return to her people and warn them of her husband's betrayal. But David had anticipated her move. He'd hired a group of bounty hunters, men with no conscience and hearts as cold as winter stone. They'd caught her at dawn, just miles from her village. Instead of bringing her back to David, they'd decided to make an example of her. "Any Indian squaw who thinks she can cross a white man needs to learn her place," one of them had snarled as they tied her to that fence post. The sign around her neck wasn't just a warning to her, it was a message to her entire people about what happened to those who stood in the way of progress. Peter felt anger building in his chest as he listened to her story. He'd seen enough cruelty during the war to last several lifetimes, and the thought of these men treating Blessing like property made his hands clench into fists. But beneath the anger was something deeper, a fierce protectiveness that surprised him with its intensity. This woman had been through hell, and somehow, fate had brought her to his doorstep. He wasn't about to let anyone hurt her again. The sound of hoofbeats reached them just as the sun began to sink toward the horizon. Peter peered through the window and counted 5 riders approaching his cabin, their faces hard as granite and their hands resting easy on their gun belts. These weren't lawmen, they were predators, and they'd come hunting. Blessing moved beside him, her body tense as a bowstring, ready to run or fight as the situation demanded. "Afternoon," called the leader, a tall man with a scar running from his left eye to his jawline. "Name's Jack Steele. We're looking for some stolen property. Indian woman about yay high answers to the name of Blessing." His voice carried the casual arrogance of a man who'd never been told no and didn't plan to start today. Peter stepped onto his porch, making sure his body blocked their view of the cabin's interior. "Haven't seen anyone matching that description," Peter replied evenly, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. He'd learned during the war that sometimes the best defense was to appear completely calm while your heart hammered against your ribs. "Might want to try the settlement about 10 miles south. Lot of folks pass through there." The lie came easily, but he could see in Steele's eyes that the man wasn't buying it. Steele dismounted slowly, his spurs jangling with each step as he approached the porch. "See, that's funny, friend, because we tracked her trail right to your property. Now maybe you're just being neighborly, trying to help out what you think is a lady in distress, but this particular woman belongs to David Morrison, and he wants her back." The way he said "belongs" made Peter's skin crawl, but he kept his expression neutral. "Like I said, Peter repeated, his voice steady as stone. Haven't seen her. The two men stared at each other for a long moment, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Behind him, Peter could hear the soft creak of floorboards as Blessing moved deeper into the cabin. Steele's eyes flicked toward the sound, and his hand dropped to his gun. The next few seconds would determine whether this ended in words or bullets, and Peter found himself hoping for words while preparing for lead. "Mind if we take a look around?" Steele asked, though his tone made it clear he wasn't really asking permission. He gestured to his men, who began to dismount with the practiced ease of experienced manhunters. Peter knew he was outnumbered and outgunned, but something inside him refused to back down. There were lines a man didn't cross, and handing over a woman to men like these was one of them. "Actually, I do mind," Peter said quietly. "This is private property, and you're not welcome here." His words hung in the air like a challenge, and he could see Steele's face darken with anger. The other men spread out slightly, forming a loose semicircle around the porch. They'd done this before, and they were good at it. But Peter had faced worse odds during the war, and he was still breathing. Steele's hand moved to his gun, but before he could draw, the cabin door opened behind Peter. Blessing stepped onto the porch, her chin raised in defiance and her eyes blazing with a courage that took Peter's breath away. "I am here," she said simply, her voice carrying across the yard with crystal clarity. "You want me? Come and take me. But know this, I am not property to be owned, and I will not go quietly." The effect of her words was immediate. Steele's men straightened in their saddles, hands moving instinctively toward their weapons. But something in Blessing's bearing gave them pause. She stood like a warrior princess, unafraid and unbroken despite everything they'd put her through. Peter felt a surge of admiration so strong it almost knocked him backward. This woman was magnificent, and he'd be damned if he let these vultures touch her. "Well, well," Steele said with a nasty smile. "There's the little Indian princess herself. Your husband's been worried sick about you, darling. Says you had some kind of breakdown, started talking crazy about him stealing land and such. He just wants to get you the help you need." The lies rolled off his tongue like honey, but his eyes remained cold as winter ice. Peter stepped closer to Blessing, his message clear. If they wanted her, they'd have to go through him first. The tension stretched like a wire about to snap. Steele's men had their hands on their guns now, waiting for their leader's signal. Peter calculated the odds and didn't like what he found. 5 experienced gunmen against 1 rancher and a woman with no weapon. But sometimes a man had to stand for something, even when the odds were impossible, especially when they were impossible. "Here's what's going to happen," Steele said, his voice taking on the patient tone of someone explaining something to a slow child. "You're going to step aside, rancher, and let us do our job. Mrs. Morrison is going to come with us, nice and peaceful-like, and everyone walks away from this breathing. That's the smart play here." His hand hovered over his gun, ready to draw at the first sign of resistance. Peter felt Blessing move slightly behind him, and he knew she was calculating her options. She could run. She was fast enough to make it to the barn before they could react, but running would leave him facing 5 guns alone, and they both knew how that would end. The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of horses shifting nervously and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. "Or," Peter said quietly, "you could ride away and tell Morrison that his wife chose to leave him. Tell him she's free to make her own decisions, and if he wants to talk to her, he can come himself instead of sending hired killers." The words carried a weight that made Steele's eyes narrow dangerously. This wasn't going according to plan, and men like Steele didn't like it when their plans went sideways. The moment balanced on a knife's edge. Peter could feel his heart pounding against his ribs, could sense Blessing's tension radiating like heat from her body. In the distance, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, promising rain and wind and change. Whatever happened in the next few seconds would alter the course of all their lives forever. And deep in his gut, Peter knew that this was one of those moments when a man discovered what he was really made of. The first gunshot split the air like thunder, but it didn't come from Steele or his men. From the ridge behind the cabin, a rifle barked once, and one of Steele's riders toppled from his saddle with a surprised grunt. Peter spun toward the sound and saw a figure silhouetted against the darkening sky, a Comanche warrior with a rifle, and behind him at least a dozen more. Blessing's people had found her. "Josephine!" Blessing called out in her native tongue, her voice ringing with joy and relief. The warrior on the ridge, clearly a woman despite the distance, raised her rifle in acknowledgement. Peter realized this must be Blessing's sister, and from the way she held that weapon, she knew how to use it. The tables had suddenly turned, and Steele's confident expression cracked like thin ice. "Well, this just got interesting," Steele muttered, his hand still hovering over his gun, but his eyes now scanning the ridgeline. More Comanche warriors were appearing, their faces painted for war and their weapons trained on the men below. They'd been watching, waiting for the right moment to act. The hunting party had become the hunted, and everyone in the yard knew it. Peter felt a surge of hope mixed with new concern. While he was grateful for the intervention, he also knew that the presence of armed Comanche warriors would escalate this situation beyond anyone's control. If shooting started in earnest, it wouldn't matter who was right or wrong. People would die, and the cycle of violence between the two peoples would continue. He had to find a way to end this without more bloodshed. "Steele," Peter called out, his voice cutting through the tension. "You're outnumbered and outgunned. The smart play now is to ride away and forget you ever saw this place." Thunder rumbled overhead as the storm clouds continued to gather, and the first fat raindrops began to fall. The weather was turning as dark and dangerous as the situation, and Peter could feel the electricity in the air, both from the approaching storm and the barely contained violence surrounding them. Josephine descended from the ridge with the fluid grace of someone who'd grown up moving through dangerous terrain. She was smaller than Blessing, but carried herself with an authority that spoke of leadership and hard-won respect. Her rifle remained trained on Steele as she approached, and her dark eyes held a cold fury that made even the hardened bounty hunter take a step back. "Sister," she said in English, never taking her eyes off Steele and his men. "Are you hurt?" Her voice carried the subtle accent of someone for whom English was a second language, but her words were clear and precise. Peter noticed that several of the warriors on the ridge had moved closer, their positions allowing them clear shots at anyone in the yard who might try something foolish. "I am well, Josephine," Blessing replied, stepping forward to stand beside her sister. "These men came hunting me like an animal. They tied me to a post and left me for the vultures." Her words were spoken in English, clearly intended for Steele and his companions to hear. The fury in Josephine's eyes intensified, and Peter saw her finger tighten on her rifle's trigger. Steele raised his hand slightly, a gesture that might have been surrender or simply an attempt to appear less threatening. "Now, ladies, there's no need for violence here. This is just a simple misunderstanding. Mrs. Morrison ran away from her husband, and we were hired to bring her home safely. That's all this is, a domestic dispute that got a little out of hand." The rain was falling harder now, turning the dust in the yard to mud and adding an ominous atmosphere to an already tense situation. Peter watched the interplay between the sisters and felt something shift in his understanding of Blessing. She wasn't just a victim who'd escaped from a bad marriage. She was part of a family, a community, a people who would fight and die for each other. The knowledge both humbled him and made him more determined than ever to protect her. "You speak of domestic disputes," Josephine said, her voice carrying the bite of winter wind. "But what you call marriage, we call theft. David Morrison stole my sister with promises of peace, then tried to steal our land with false papers. When she refused to betray her people, he sent dogs like you to drag her back." Her words cut through the rain like a blade, and Peter could see the truth of them written in Steele's uncomfortable shifting. Steele's men were looking increasingly nervous, their eyes darting between the women in front of them and the warriors above. This wasn't the easy job they'd signed up for, and the odds had shifted dramatically against them. "Look," Steele said, his voice losing some of its earlier confidence. "We're just doing what we were paid to do. Morrison wants his wife back, and legally she belongs to him." "I belong to no man," Blessing said firmly, stepping forward until she was close enough to touch Steele's chest. "I am Comanche. I am free. And if David Morrison wants to speak with me, he can come himself and face the warriors he has wronged." Her words rang with such conviction that even Steele seemed momentarily at a loss for words. This wasn't the broken, frightened woman they'd expected to find. Peter found himself mesmerized by the strength radiating from both sisters. They stood together like twin pillars of defiance, unafraid of the guns pointed in their direction. He'd never seen courage like this, not during the war, not in all his years of living. These women were warriors in every sense of the word, and he felt honored to stand beside them, even if it meant facing impossible odds. The storm was reaching its full fury now, with lightning flickering across the darkened sky and thunder rolling like artillery fire. In the midst of the chaos, natural and human, Peter made a decision that would change everything. He stepped forward, placing himself directly between Steele's men and the sisters. "The ladies have made their position clear," he said loudly enough to be heard over the storm. "Now it's time for you to make your choice." Lightning split the sky with a brilliant flash, illuminating the yard in stark black and white for a heartbeat before plunging it back into stormy twilight. In that moment of electric clarity, Peter saw the calculation in Steele's eyes, the way his men's hands trembled slightly on their weapons, and the absolute determination written across the faces of the Comanche warriors watching from above. The next few seconds would determine whether this ended in words or became a bloodbath. "You know what, friend?" Steele said finally, his voice carrying forced casualness that didn't quite hide his unease. "Maybe you're right. Maybe this job isn't worth dying for." He took a slow step backward, his hands moving away from his guns in a gesture of surrender. "Morrison can hire better men if he wants his woman back so badly. Men who don't mind facing down an army of savages for his money." Peter felt the insult to Blessing's people like a physical blow, but before he could respond, Josephine's rifle shifted slightly. The message was clear. One more word like that, and Steele would be eating lead instead of dinner. The bounty hunter seemed to understand the threat because his next words were considerably more respectful. "We'll be riding out now, but this isn't over. Morrison has friends in high places, and he won't give up easy." As Steele and his remaining men mounted their horses, Peter felt Blessing move closer to his side. Her presence was warm and reassuring despite the cold rain soaking through their clothes. "Thank you," she said quietly, her words meant for his ears alone. "You did not have to risk your life for a stranger." The gratitude in her voice made something inside his chest tighten with emotion he wasn't ready to name. The bounty hunters rode away into the storm, their figures quickly swallowed by the rain and gathering darkness. But Peter knew Steele's parting words carried weight. This was far from over. David Morrison wouldn't give up easily, and men with money and influence had ways of getting what they wanted that didn't involve direct confrontation. The battle might be won, but the war was just beginning. As the storm raged outside, Peter's cabin became a sanctuary filled with quiet conversation and the soft crackle of the fire he'd built to ward off the evening chill. Josephine and 3 of her warriors had accepted his invitation to stay until the weather cleared, though the rest of her band maintained their vigil on the surrounding ridges. The cabin felt smaller with so many people inside, but also warmer and more alive than it had in years. Blessing sat cross-legged near the fire, her hair finally dry and gleaming like black silk in the firelight. She'd changed from her torn dress into spare clothes Josephine had brought, traditional Comanche garments that seemed to restore some essential part of her spirit. Watching her laugh softly at something her sister whispered, Peter realized he was seeing the real Blessing for the first time, not the frightened woman he'd found tied to a post. "My sister tells me you are a good man," Josephine said, settling beside Peter with the fluid grace that seemed to run in their family. "She says you cut her bonds without question, without asking what she might have done to deserve such treatment. In our culture, such kindness creates a debt that must be repaid." Her dark eyes studied his face with an intensity that made him feel like she was reading his soul. Peter shifted uncomfortably under her scrutiny. "I didn't do it for any reward. No one deserves to be treated like an animal, regardless of their race or what they might have done." His words came out more forcefully than he'd intended, and he could see both sisters exchange a meaningful look. Apparently, his feelings on the matter were more transparent than he'd realized. The conversation continued late into the night, ranging from practical matters like supplies and safe passage to deeper questions about the growing tensions between white settlers and native peoples. Peter found himself drawn into discussions about justice, survival, and the possibility of two very different worlds finding common ground. And through it all, he was acutely aware of Blessing's presence, the way her eyes lit up when she spoke passionately about something, the gentle sound of her laughter when Josephine told stories of their childhood. The storm had passed by dawn, leaving the world washed clean and sparkling with raindrops that caught the early sunlight like diamonds. Peter woke to find the cabin empty, except for himself. The Comanche visitors had vanished as silently as they'd appeared, leaving no trace of their presence except the lingering scent of sage and wood smoke. For a moment, he wondered if the entire evening had been a dream, but then he heard voices outside. Blessing stood in his small garden, speaking quietly with Josephine while the other warriors prepared their horses for departure. In the clear morning light, Peter could see the family resemblance between the sisters, the same proud bearing, the same intelligent eyes, the same unbreakable strength that had carried them through trials that would have broken lesser people. But there was something different about Blessing now, a sadness that hadn't been there the night before. "We must return to our people," Josephine was saying as Peter approached. "The elders need to know what David Morrison is planning. If he truly intends to claim our sacred lands, we must prepare for war." Her words carried the weight of leadership, and Peter realized she must hold a position of significant authority within her tribe. The knowledge made him respect her even more. Blessing nodded, but Peter could see the conflict in her expression. Part of her wanted to go with her sister, to return to the familiar safety of her people. But another part, the part that had been forever changed by her experiences with Morrison, seemed reluctant to leave this place where she'd found unexpected kindness and protection. The internal struggle was written clearly across her features. "You are welcome to stay," Peter said quietly, the words surprising even him. "Both of you, all of you. This ranch is big enough, and there's always work to be done." The offer hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond simple hospitality. He was offering them sanctuary, but he was also offering Blessing something else, a choice about her own future, free from the demands of both her husband and her tribe. Blessing turned to look at him, her dark eyes wide with surprise and something that might have been hope. For a long moment she said nothing, but Peter could see her weighing options, considering possibilities she might never have imagined before. The silence stretched on, filled with the sound of wind through the prairie grass and the distant call of meadowlarks greeting the morning. "Sister," Josephine said carefully, "our people need to know you are safe. They have been worried, and the elders have been asking questions about Morrison's activities. Your testimony could be crucial in preparing our defenses." Her words were gentle but firm, carrying the weight of family obligation and tribal responsibility. Peter could see the struggle intensifying in Blessing's expression. I know my duty to our people, Blessing replied, her voice soft but steady. But I also know that if I return now, Morrison will never stop hunting me. He has claimed me as property, and his pride will not allow him to let me go peacefully. Going back puts everyone in danger. Not just me, but my family, my entire tribe. The wisdom in her words was undeniable, but Peter could see how much it cost her to say them. Josephine studied her sister's face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You have grown wise in your suffering, little sister. Perhaps you are right to stay here, at least for now. But promise me this. If you need us, if this man Morrison brings more trouble than you can handle, you will send word. The bonds of family are stronger than any white man's law. Peter felt his heart skip a beat as he realized what was happening. Blessing was choosing to stay, not just for a few days or weeks, but for the foreseeable future. The knowledge filled him with a mixture of joy and terror, because he knew that protecting her would likely cost him everything he'd built here. But looking at her face, seeing the quiet courage and determination written there, he knew he'd make the same choice 1,000 times over. The farewell between the sisters was brief but intense, filled with words in their native language that Peter couldn't understand, but felt the emotion behind. Josephine embraced Blessing fiercely, whispering what sounded like prayers or promises before mounting her horse. As the small band of warriors rode away, Blessing stood watching until they disappeared over the horizon, her hand raised in a final gesture of farewell. I hope I have not made a mistake, she said quietly, more to herself than to Peter. Leaving my people, trusting a stranger, believing that there might be a place in this world where I can simply be myself without fear. Her voice carried a vulnerability that made Peter want to wrap her in his arms and promise her that everything would be all right. But he held back. She needed time and space to process her decision. Instead, he busied himself with the morning chores, giving her privacy to work through her emotions while staying close enough to provide comfort if she needed it. As he fed the horses and checked the fence lines, he found himself thinking about the changes her presence would bring to his quiet, solitary life. The cabin would need modifications to provide her with proper privacy. He'd need to stock more supplies, consider her needs and preferences in everything from food to clothing. But beyond the practical considerations, there were deeper questions that made his pulse quicken with anticipation and anxiety. What kind of relationship would develop between them? She was still technically married, though that marriage had clearly been destroyed by Morrison's betrayal and greed. Would there be a chance for something more than mere friendship and protection to grow between them? And even if there was, could two people from such different worlds truly build a life together? The morning passed quietly, with both of them lost in their own thoughts while going about the business of daily survival. But as the sun climbed higher and the day warmed, Peter began to notice small changes in Blessing's demeanor. The tension in her shoulders eased slightly. Her movements became less guarded, more natural, and once, when he caught her eye across the yard, she gave him a small smile that made his heart race like a schoolboy's. Over the following days, a tentative routine developed between them. Peter had given Blessing his bed and set up a makeshift sleeping area for himself near the fireplace, an arrangement that maintained propriety while keeping them close enough to protect each other if danger arose. She proved to be remarkably capable, helping with everything from cooking to mending harness leather with skills that spoke of a life spent in practical survival rather than idle luxury. Their conversations during these shared tasks revealed depths to her character that amazed and humbled him. She spoke of her childhood among the Comanche, of learning to ride before she could properly walk, of long nights listening to the elders tell stories that preserved the wisdom of generations. But she also talked about her time with Morrison, the genuine hope she'd felt when their marriage began, and the crushing disappointment as she'd watched the man she'd thought she loved transform into someone she couldn't recognize. I believed I could bridge two worlds, she told him one evening as they sat by the fire after dinner. "I thought that love could overcome the hatred and fear between our peoples. David seemed to understand my culture, to respect it even, but when gold entered the picture, everything changed. Money has a way of revealing who people really are." Her words carried a bitter wisdom that spoke of hard-learned lessons about human nature. Peter found himself sharing stories of his own past, his childhood on a farm in Pennsylvania, his experiences during the war, the reasons he'd come west seeking isolation and peace. He told her about the nightmares that still sometimes woke him in the cold hours before dawn, about the guilt he carried over things he'd done and failed to do during those terrible years of conflict. She listened without judgment, offering the kind of understanding that comes only from someone who's faced their own darkness. As the days passed, Peter began to notice changes in himself as well. The cabin felt less like a hiding place and more like a home. He found himself looking forward to their evening conversations, to the sound of her laughter when he told stories about his more spectacular failures as a rancher. The loneliness that had been his constant companion for 3 years began to lift, replaced by something warmer and more hopeful than he dared to imagine possible. The fragile peace they'd built was shattered on a Tuesday morning when Peter spotted a large group of riders approaching from the east. Even at a distance, he could see they weren't Comanche. Their posture in the saddle and the way they moved spoke of white men, probably well-armed and definitely looking for trouble. Blessing appeared at his shoulder, having seen them too, and her sharp intake of breath told him everything he needed to know. "David," she whispered, and Peter could hear the fear and anger warring in her voice. At the head of the approaching group rode a tall man with sandy hair and expensive clothes, flanked by at least a dozen hired guns who looked like they'd shoot their own mothers for the right price. This wasn't Steele's ragtag band of bounty hunters. This was a small army, and they'd come prepared for war. "Get to the root cellar," Peter said urgently, but Blessing shook her head. "If I hide and he doesn't find me, he'll burn down everything you've built here. I won't let you suffer for my choices." Her determination was admirable, but potentially fatal, and Peter found himself torn between admiration for her courage and terror at what Morrison might do if he got his hands on her again. Morrison called out when he was still 50 yards away, his voice carrying the cultured accent of an educated man who'd learned to command through money rather than respect. "Mr. Beaumont, I believe you have something that belongs to me. I've come to collect my wife and discuss the unfortunate misunderstanding that led to her temporary absence." The false civility in his tone made Peter's skin crawl. "She's not property, Morrison," Peter called back, stepping onto his porch with his rifle in plain view. "And from what I hear, your marriage ended the moment you tried to force her into betraying her own people." He could see Morrison's face tighten with anger at the public contradiction, and the hired guns around him shifted restlessly in their saddles. The morning air crackled with tension, and Peter knew that words alone wouldn't resolve this confrontation. Morrison dismounted with theatrical flourish, his movements calculated to project confidence and control. Up close, Peter could see he was handsome in a conventional way. The kind of man who'd learned early that his appearance and charm could open doors that his character couldn't. But there was something cold in his pale blue eyes, a calculating emptiness that spoke of a soul willing to sacrifice anything and anyone for personal gain. "Blessing, my dear," Morrison said, his voice dripping with false affection as she stepped onto the porch beside Peter. "You've led me quite a chase. I've been worried sick about you, imagining all sorts of terrible things that might have befallen you in the wilderness." The concern in his voice was so obviously manufactured that it would have been laughable if the situation weren't so dangerous. "Save your lies for someone who hasn't heard them before, David," Blessing replied, her voice steady despite the tension Peter could feel radiating from her body. "I know what you really want, and it has nothing to do with love or marriage. You want my signature on those papers, and you want my people's land." Everything else is just pretense." Her words cut through his facade like a knife through silk. Morrison's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the cold fury beneath. "You ungrateful little savage," he snarled, then seemed to catch himself and reassemble his composure. "The wilderness has clearly affected your mind, darling. Perhaps a period of rest and medical care will help you remember your duties as a wife." The threat was unmistakable, and Peter felt his finger tighten on his rifle's trigger. "The only thing I remember," Blessing said with quiet dignity, "is that I once loved a man who turned out to be an illusion. The real David Morrison is standing before me now, a thief and a liar who would sell his own soul for gold." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, and Peter could see Morrison's hired guns growing restless. The time for talking was rapidly running out, and everyone in the yard knew it. Morrison's facade finally cracked completely, revealing the ugly truth beneath his civilized veneer. "Enough!" he roared, his face contorting with rage. "I am your husband, and you are my property. I've spent a fortune tracking you down, and I'll be damned if I'll let some half-breed squaw make a fool of me in front of my men." The raw hatred in his voice made Peter's blood run cold, but it also crystallized his resolve. "She's not going anywhere with you," Peter said firmly, raising his rifle to a more threatening position. "Not today, not ever. Find yourself another way to get rich, Morrison, because this woman is under my protection now." The words carried a finality that seemed to echo across the yard, and Peter could see the hired guns tensing for action. Morrison laughed, but there was no humor in the sound, only bitter triumph. "Your protection? You pathetic fool! Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? I have friends in the territorial government, connections in Washington. I can make you disappear without a trace, and no one will ever ask questions." His threats carried the weight of truth, and Peter knew he was probably right about his political connections. But before Morrison could say more, the crack of a rifle shot split the morning air. One of his hired guns toppled from his saddle, and suddenly the ridge lines around the ranch erupted with Comanche warriors. Josephine had returned with what looked like half the tribe, their war paint gleaming in the sunlight and their weapons trained on Morrison's men. The hunting party had become the hunted once again. "It seems the odds have changed, husband," Blessing said with quiet satisfaction. "My people have not forgotten the insults you've paid them or the threats you've made against their land. Perhaps you should have brought more men." Her words carried a strength and confidence that made Peter's heart swell with pride and admiration. This was no victim cowering before her oppressor. This was a warrior princess reclaiming her power. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, with Morrison's hired guns finding themselves surrounded and outgunned by Comanche warriors who had appeared as if by magic from the landscape itself. Morrison's face had gone pale beneath his tan, and his eyes darted frantically around the yard as he calculated his rapidly dwindling options. The man who'd arrived with such arrogant confidence now looked like what he really was, a petty tyrant whose power evaporated the moment he faced real opposition. "You can't do this," Morrison said, his voice cracking slightly. "I'm a United States citizen. There are laws." His words were cut off by Josephine's sharp laughter as she rode into the yard, her rifle trained steadily on his chest. Behind her came an elderly Comanche man whose bearing and elaborate headdress marked him as a chief or shaman of significant importance. "Your laws," the old man said in perfect English, his voice carrying the weight of authority earned through decades of leadership, "do not extend to our sacred lands. And your marriage to our daughter was based on lies and deception. In our law, such a union is void, meaningless as smoke in the wind." Peter could see Morrison's last hopes crumbling as he realized he had no legal or moral ground to stand on. The hired guns were looking increasingly nervous, their eyes darting between their employer and the warriors surrounding them. These were men who fought for money, not principle, and facing down an army of Comanche warriors for Morrison's gold was starting to look like a losing proposition. One by one, they began raising their hands in surrender, clearly more interested in living to fight another day than dying for a man who'd probably shortchanged them anyway. "Please," Morrison said, his voice taking on a wheedling tone that made Peter's skin crawl. "Be reasonable. I can pay you, all of you, gold, silver, whatever you want. There's no need for violence here." But his desperate offers fell on deaf ears. These people had heard his promises before, and they'd learned the hard way what Morrison's word was really worth. The resolution came swiftly and with surprising mercy. The Comanche chief spoke briefly with Josephine in their native tongue, then turned to address Morrison with the calm dignity of someone pronouncing judgment. "You will leave this place and never return," he said simply. "Your marriage to our daughter is ended. Your claims to our land are rejected. If you are seen on Comanche territory again, you will not leave alive." Morrison's hired guns needed no further encouragement. They mounted their horses and rode away without a backward glance, leaving their former employer standing alone in the yard. Morrison himself seemed to age 10 years in as many seconds, his shoulders sagging with the weight of defeat. "This isn't over," he said weakly, but everyone present knew it was an empty threat from a broken man. "Yes, it is," Blessing said firmly, stepping down from the porch to face him directly. "It's been over since the day you chose gold over honor, wealth over love. You destroyed our marriage with your own greed, David. I'm just finally free to acknowledge it." Her words carried a finality that seemed to physically deflate Morrison, and without another word, he mounted his horse and rode away, a pathetic figure disappearing into the distance. As the Comanche warriors melted back into the landscape as mysteriously as they'd appeared, Peter found himself alone with Blessing once again. But the silence between them now was different, charged with possibilities that hadn't existed before. She was truly free now, her marriage officially ended, and her future her own to determine. The question was what she would choose to do with that freedom. "I have a confession to make," Blessing said quietly, turning to face him with eyes that shimmered with unshed tears of relief and joy. "When I chose to stay here instead of returning with Josephine, it wasn't just about safety or convenience. Somewhere in these past weeks I fell in love with a lonely rancher who risked everything to protect a stranger. If you'll have me, not as someone seeking protection, but as a woman choosing love over fear, I'd like to make this place our home." Peter's answer was to sweep her into his arms and kiss her with all the passion and tenderness he'd been holding back, knowing that sometimes the greatest adventures begin not with grand gestures, but with two hearts choosing to trust in love's impossible promise of forever.